ice pick wound.
It sounds crazy, right?
Yeah.
But that tiny puncture, especially near the ear, can be, oh man, more dangerous than a massive knife wound in the, well, wrong hands.
Or should I say the right hands for someone with the wrong intentions.
Right.
You see, it's all about what lies beneath. And today we're diving deep into the world of sharp force injuries to uncover those hidden truths.
It's fascinating how a seemingly small injury can tell such a complex story.
And that's what we, as forensic pathologists, try to unravel.
So before we get into those fascinating details, let's set the scene for our listeners.
Okay.
When we talk about sharp force injuries, what exactly are we dealing with?
Well, broadly, we categorize them into 4 types.
Stab wounds, your classic puncture.
Mm-hmm.
Incised wounds, those clean cuts.
Chop wounds, more brutal force involved there. And lastly, the therapeutic or diagnostic wounds, from surgeries.
Okay, so we're leaving the operating room out of this.
Right.
That means we're dealing with the first 3, each leaving its own mark, literally.
Let's go back to that ice pick example.
Okay.
You said it's all about what lies beneath.
Yeah.
How can something so small be so deadly?
It's all about anatomy.
That tiny ice pick wound.
It can be fatal if it severs a major artery, like the vertebral artery near the ear.
You wouldn't think something so small could cause such damage, right?
Right.
Highlighting why we, as forensic pathologists, need a deep understanding of the human body.
Makes you realize how a single precise strike can be more lethal than a frenzy of blows.
It's not always about the size of the weapon, but the knowledge of where to strike.
Exactly. It's about precision, targeting vital points.
And that's what we see with stabbings as well.
Huh?
It's a misconception that a deep stab wound always equals extreme force.
You mean you don't need to be a bodybuilder to inflict a serious stab wound?
Precisely. A sharp knife, especially one with a fine point, can slide through skin with minimal force.
It's like the difference between pushing a thumbtack into a corkboard and pushing a pencil.
Okay.
The sharper object needs less force.
So how do you determine how much force was actually used in a stabbing?
It's like detective work.
We look at the wound's depth, the shape, the edges.
Mm-hmm.
Then we consider the weapon.
A rusty blade versus a razor-sharp one will leave different marks. Even the victim's movements during the attack can change the wound's appearance.
And this is where those Langer's lines come in, right?
I read that they can make a single knife leave different-looking wounds.
Absolutely. These invisible lines of elasticity in our skin, they're like a hidden blueprint influencing how a wound looks.
Imagine cutting a piece of fabric.
Okay.
Cutting with the grain results in a smooth cut, while going against it causes the fabric to fray. Same with skin.
A stab perpendicular to Langer's lines gapes open more than one parallel to them because you're essentially cutting against the grain.
So a single knife, used in 2 different areas, can tell 2 very different stories depending on these Langer's lines.
Precisely. It's like each part of our body has its own unique way of reacting to a sharp force injury.
And understanding these nuances, like the direction of Langer's lines, helps us reconstruct the scene, almost like reading the story etched onto the skin.
It's amazing how something so seemingly simple, a single wound, can be so incredibly complex.
Now, let's say we've got our wound and we need to find the weapon.
Okay.
Is it like the movies where you can match striations on a bullet to a gun?
Can you match a knife to a stab wound?
It's not as clear-cut, unfortunately.
While we can sometimes make educated guesses about the weapon, like if it was single or double-edged or the blade's width, actually linking a specific knife to a wound is rare.
So no CSI magic bullet comparison for knives.
Wish it were that easy.
Unlike bullets, knives can twist during stabbing. The victim might move.
Right.
And those Langer's lines we talked about add another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
It becomes less about perfect matches and more about ruling possibilities in or out.
So what can definitively link a knife to a stab wound?
The holy grail. A broken knife tip embedded in bone.
That's our fingerprint match.
It allows for a perfect tool mark comparison, but it's rare.
Most times, the best we can do is say a particular knife could have caused the injuries, not definitively say this is the weapon.
Fascinating. So we've got these stabbings with everyday knives,
Right.
but then there are those cases, the ones that make you say, did they really use that?
Tell me about those barbecue fork injuries.
Oh, those are interesting.
People can get, well, creative.
A barbecue fork usually leaves a cluster of 2 or 3 equally spaced wounds, mirroring the fork's prongs. It's almost like a signature.
Like each tool leaves its own calling card.
What about a Phillips screwdriver?
I imagine those leave a pretty distinct mark.
You'd be surprised. We see them more than you think.
And they leave a very telltale sign. A circular wound with 4 equally spaced cuts radiating out from the center. It's all thanks to that X-shaped point.
Okay, that's one detail I won't forget anytime soon.
It's like a morbid game of guess the weapon based on the wound patterns.
In a way, yes. Each weapon, from a barbecue fork to a screwdriver, interacts with the body in a unique way, and understanding these patterns helps us decipher what happened.
It's incredible how much you can learn from just observing these patterns.
But let's move from those puncture wounds to their close relative, the incised wound, the cut.
Sure.
What makes them stand out?
The key is to distinguish a clean incised wound made by a sharp edge from a laceration, which is more of a tear, often from blunt force.
Imagine slicing bread cleanly with a knife versus tearing it apart.
So a clean cut versus a messy tear.
How can you tell the difference just by looking at the wound?
An incised wound has those smooth, clean edges.
Just like a surgical incision.
Okay.
A laceration, however, will be jagged, irregular, and often bruised around the edges.
So one is precise, the other chaotic.
And then there are those wrinkle wounds you mentioned earlier, which sound interesting. Tell me more about those.
Picture this. Someone slashes at an arm, but the arm is bent, causing wrinkles.
Now, instead of one long cut, you get multiple cuts as the blade hits those folds.
So a single slash could look like multiple attacks. Talk about misleading.
Exactly. That's why context is crucial. We can't just analyze the wound.
We need the full picture. The victim's position, the scene, everything.
Right.
It's like piecing together a puzzle.
It's amazing how even a seemingly simple cut can hold so many clues. Speaking of clues, what about self-inflicted cuts?
What sets them apart?
Self-inflicted cuts often have what we call hesitation marks.
These are those faint, superficial cuts made before the deeper, more decisive cut.
Like testing the water before diving in.
Exactly. These hesitation marks are usually near the deeper wound, almost parallel to it.
They can tell us a lot about the person's state of mind.
So these marks aren't just physical. They offer a glimpse into someone's emotional state as well.
Precisely. They taint a fuller picture of the event and the mindset of the individual.
That's incredible. It's like you're not just looking at a wound, you're looking into someone's final moments.
Where are these self-inflicted cuts usually located?
With incised wounds, we primarily see them on the wrists and forearms, where the veins are close to the surface. And the direction of the cut can be telling too.
A right-handed person attempting suicide will typically have cuts on their left wrist or forearm and vice versa.
So even the direction the wound travels can speak volumes. What about cuts on the neck?
Can their direction tell us about the attacker?
Absolutely. An attack from behind usually leaves a long, deep wound, starting high on one side of the neck, curving down and across to the other side.
Like an elongated U shape.
Okay.
Imagine the attacker bringing the weapon down in a sweeping motion.
So the wound mirrors the attack.
Precisely. Now contrast that with an attack from the front.
These wounds are typically shorter, more angled cuts. It all depends on the attacker's handedness and position relative to the victim.
It's fascinating how you can reconstruct the entire scene just from the direction of a cut.
That's the power of observation and understanding the mechanics of the human body. It's about looking beyond the obvious.
Speaking of going beyond the obvious, let's talk about those sharp force injuries that don't involve your typical knives or blades.
Okay.
I'm talking about chop wounds.
Those always seem brutal, even compared to stabbings.
They can be quite devastating. Chop wounds combine a sharp edge with significant force. We're talking about axes, machetes, cleavers, tools designed for powerful blows.
And those blows, they must leave some pretty distinct marks, right?
Absolutely. Think of it this way. A stab wound is like a focused puncture, while a chop wound is more like a crushing, splitting force.
You're much more likely to see bone damage with chop wounds, too.
Can you give me an example of what a characteristic chop wound might look like?
Imagine an axe blow to the skull. You're not just going to see a deep gash in the scalp. You'll likely see the skull fractured beneath it.
And that fracture will have a very specific pattern that helps us understand how the axe was used. Was it a swinging motion?
A direct hit, the bone tells us.
It's like forensic paleontology, but instead of digging up dinosaur bones, you're piecing together the story of a crime through the bones of a victim.
It's an interesting way to look at it, and in a way, it's accurate.
Speaking of unexpected discoveries, I never thought I'd consider broken glass and china as serious weapons, but here we are.
You'd be amazed how often we see these seemingly innocuous items causing significant injury.
Oh, really?
People underestimate just how sharp a broken wine glass or a shattered plate can be.
I imagine these wounds could easily be misidentified as something else.
They often are.
At first glance, an injury from broken glass might look like a simple laceration,
Right.
a messy wound from blunt force.
But a closer look reveals those clean edges.
The lack of bruising that you see with a blunt force injury,
Okay.
and it becomes clear this was caused by a sharp edge.
It's a reminder that even in cases where things seem straightforward, a deeper look can reveal a different story.
It's all about the details.
Exactly. Every detail matters in forensic science. It's about peeling back the layers and looking for those subtle clues that tell the real story.
And speaking of stories, let's talk about a tool we all have in our homes that can become a surprisingly dangerous weapon. You might not expect it, but scissors can leave their own mark on a crime scene.
That they can.
And unfortunately, we see it more often than one might think.
Particularly in domestic disputes.
Depending on how they're used, scissors can create quite distinctive wound patterns.
What kind of pattern are we talking about? I've never really thought of scissors as leaving a signature wound.
Well, if someone is stabbed with closed scissors, the wound often resembles like a Z shape,
Those offset blades
Okay.
each leave their own little cut as the scissors go in.
creating that distinctive pattern.
A Z shape. That's a chilling calling card. We've been talking about the offense, the stabbings, the slashings, the chops. But what about the defense?
What can those defense wounds tell us about a struggle?
Defense wounds are incredibly valuable.
They tell us there was a fight, a struggle for life. They give us a glimpse into the victim's state of mind during those final moments.
We can tell if they were conscious, aware of what was happening.
Exactly.
The presence of defense wounds tells us the victim was conscious and trying to protect themselves.
They weren't just passive.
Right.
And that can be crucial information, especially if someone tries to argue the attack was quick, that the victim didn't suffer.
So these wounds speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves.
Where do we typically find these defense wounds?
Mostly on the hands and forearms.
It's instinct to raise your arms to protect your head and face.
Right.
So we often see cuts on the palms, the backs of the hands, the forearms.
Anywhere the victim might have tried to block a blow or grab the weapon.
It's a grim picture, but it paints a powerful image of that struggle for survival. As we've been going through these different types of injuries, it's striking how much information you can glean from what seems like a simple cut or a puncture. It makes you realize how important context is in your line of work.
Context is everything.
We can't just analyze a wound in isolation. We need to consider the whole picture.
Right.
The scene, the position of the body, any witness statements.
And of course, the medical history of the victim.
Right?
Everything contributes to understanding the story the wound is telling us.
Let's talk about that a bit more. How does the victim's medical history play into analyzing sharp force injuries?
It's a great question.
You see, certain medical conditions can make someone more susceptible to severe injury from what might appear to be a minor wound. For example, someone with a bleeding disorder might bleed out more quickly from a small cut than someone without the condition.
So something seemingly insignificant to one person could be life-threatening to another.
Precisely. That's why we don't just look at the wound itself, but we also consider the individual's overall health and medical history.
It all adds to the complexity of the puzzle we're trying to solve.
It's like each case is a combination lock, and you're trying to find the right combination of factors to unlock the truth.
That's a great analogy.
It's about piecing together the clues, understanding the interplay of anatomy, weapon dynamics, and individual circumstances. And sometimes it's those subtle, almost invisible details that reveal the most crucial information.
Speaking of subtle details, you mentioned earlier that even the angle of a stab wound can be telling. How does that factor into your analysis?
The angle can reveal a lot about the attack itself. A downward stab wound might suggest the attacker was taller than the victim.
Or perhaps the victim was lying down. A stab wound from an upward angle might indicate the opposite, or a struggle where the victim was on the ground.
It's incredible how these minute details can provide such valuable insights into what happened.
It's all about connecting the dots, like putting together a jigsaw puzzle.
Each piece, each detail, contributes to the bigger picture.
We often see these dramatic depictions of stabbings in movies and TV shows.
But they rarely show the aftermath, the analysis, the painstaking work of piecing together those fragments of information.
And that's the real story, isn't it?
The science behind the scenes.
Right.
It's not always glamorous, but it's incredibly rewarding to be able to use our knowledge to help solve crimes and bring justice to victims.
And to think, it all starts with something as seemingly simple as a sharp force injury. It's a stark reminder that every cut, every puncture, tells a story.
And sometimes it's the smallest, most easily overlooked details that speak the loudest.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface and delving into the science, the mechanics, the human element.
And that's what makes this field so fascinating.
It's like you're giving a voice to the voiceless, using your knowledge to reconstruct the past.
To understand the why and how of these violent acts.
That's a very powerful way to put it.
And it's something we never take for granted. Every case is a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of seeking justice for those who have been silenced.
Absolutely. And as we move toward the end of our deep dive today, I can't help but think back to that ice pick example we started with.
It's a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the smallest of wounds can have the most devastating consequences.
It's a truth we see time and time again in our line of work. A tiny puncture wound could be just as deadly, if not more so, than a large gaping wound. It's all about what lies beneath.
Both literally and figuratively.
It's about looking beyond the obvious, about understanding the intricate workings of the human body and the mechanics of injury.
And I think that's a powerful takeaway for our listeners today.
I completely agree. It's about appreciating the complexity hidden within these seemingly simple injuries and recognizing that every wound tells a story that we, as forensic pathologists, are here to uncover.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into the world of sharp force injuries. But before we go, we've got one more thought-provoking question for our listeners, something to ponder as you navigate your day.
Knowing what you now know about sharp force injuries, about the hidden stories they tell, how would you approach a crime scene where the murder weapon is missing?
That's an excellent question.
And it gets to the heart of forensic investigation.
Without the murder weapon, the wound itself becomes our most valuable clue.
So it's like the wound becomes the silent witness.
Precisely. We become like detectives of the dermis, reading the story etched onto the victim's skin.
Okay, let's play that out. Imagine we walk onto a crime scene.
What's the first thing you're looking at when you see a sharp force injury?
First, we determine what type of sharp force injury we're dealing with. Is it a stab wound?
An incised wound. A chop wound.
Each tells a different story about the weapon used and the force applied.
Right. So if it's a stab wound, we're looking for those telltale signs of the weapon.
The barbecue forks, multiple punctures, the Z pattern of scissors.
Those kinds of things.
Exactly. And we're also analyzing the depth, the angle, the shape of the wound.
These details can tell us about the attacker's freight, their position relative to the victim, even whether the victim was moving during the attack.
It's amazing how much information you can extract from these seemingly small details.
And it doesn't stop there. Remember those Liner's lines we discussed?
Those can help us determine the direction from which the force was applied,
further refining our understanding of the attack.
It's like each piece of information builds upon the last, creating a more detailed picture of what transpired.
And let's not forget about those defense wounds.
The presence or absence of these wounds can tell us if the victim was conscious.
If they tried to fight back.
Right.
And that can be crucial information in a case where the weapon is missing.
It's like you're giving a voice to the voiceless, allowing the wounds themselves to tell the story of what happened.
That's a very poetic way to put it, but it's true. Every injury, every mark left on the body has a story to tell. And it's our job to listen carefully and interpret those stories accurately.
And by listening to those stories, by understanding the language of sharp force injuries, we can hopefully work towards preventing them in the future.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, this knowledge isn't just about solving crimes, it's about protecting lives.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. We've spent this episode exploring the science behind sharp force injuries, the clues they hold, and the stories they tell. But beyond the technical details, it's important to remember the human cost of these acts. Each case represents a life lost or forever altered. So as you go about your day, carry with you the weight of this knowledge, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the importance of empathy, understanding, and working towards a world free from violence. This has been a fascinating and frankly eye-opening deep dive. Thank you to our expert for guiding us through this complex and often overlooked world.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, until next time, stay curious, keep learning, never stop.